which is a panel discussion on balanced approach for spectrum allocations. And ladies and gentlemen, in this session, the highlights and best practices for a balanced spectrum allocation policy for India will be shared, and the time duration for the session will be 30 minutes. We have cut short some time as we are running behind schedule. The session will be chaired by Mr. Sunil, who is Additional Director General Prasar Bharati. He is present with us on the virtual platform. He has 33 years of experience in broadcasting, is the Additional Director General Prasar Bharati and Head of International Relations, Marketing, Global Distribution, Central Archives and External Services Division of All India Radio. Mr. Sunil has rich experience in installation of broadcasting projects in India and overseas, has been a member of the Technical Advisory Group of Department of Space and Secretary of Broadcasting Engineering Society of India, winner of the Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union Broadcast Excellence Award 2018 and recipient of IETESN Mitra Memorial Award 2016. And our eminent panelist is Dr. Laura. Before I introduce Dr. Laura, a warm welcome to Mr. Sunil. Thank you for being here with us, sir. And I now introduce Dr. Laura Roberti, our eminent panelist, is a Director of Spectrum and Market Access in Telesat. She's globally responsible for Telesat regulatory licenses and authorizations, including the new Telesat Lightspeed system. She also participates in related ITUR and ITUD work. Dr. Laura has a PhD in electronic engineering from Polytechnic of Turin, Italy, and many years of experience working in industry and academic and research world. Her experience covers satellite and terrestrial telecommunication systems and spectrum management and engineering. She is the author of several research papers in the area of radio propagation, and prior to Telesat, she has worked for Inmarsat, British Telecom, NASA, and the Polytechnic of Turin. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am. And on the panel, we have as eminent speaker Mr. Mehul Bhandari, who is Senior Advisor Policy and Regulatory Viasat, and is the India focal point of Viasat in delivering the organization's regulatory and spectrum policy engagements. Has been an active part of communications industry in India as part of Telecom Equipment and Services Export Promotion Council, an international mobile operator, and a global mobile association. He is also co-author of the IEEE publication on spectrum sharing in cognitive radio network for the 5G vision and regulatory submission on dynamic spectrum sharing. And a very warm welcome to you, Mr. Bhandari. And last but not the least, on the panel we have with us Mr. Mohaned Juwad, who's Director Spectrum Policy Intelsat, is an accomplished regulatory expert in spectrum engineering and policy with specialized expertise in SATCOM and satellite spectrum regulations. A warm welcome to you, Mr. Mohaned. And with those words of introduction, I hand over to our chairperson, Mr. Sunil. Over to you, sir. May I once again remind you, we have time duration of 30 minutes.
Yeah. Good evening, esteemed dignitaries. Delighted to be here in the august presence of Dr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, Dr. R.K. Saxena, Dr. Karandikar, Dr. S.N. Gupta, Dr. Subbarao, Janet Chandile, and the dignified audience. Thank you, Dr. Anil Prakash and Rajiv, for inviting me today to this panel discussion. Friends, we are well aware that this organizing forum aims to promote adoption of a non-discriminatory and technology-neutral spectrum policy in India, which helps to create policies to facilitate the entry of new technologies and competitors into the market, encouraging and promoting innovation. The advancements in the satellite industry support dynamic allocation of capacity and multi-beam STS capability, which enable spectrum reuse and efficient use of spectrum. We are well aware that the coveted 28 GHz has become a bone of contention between the telecom operators on one side and the global SATCOM players on the other side, with a major telecom operator in India proposing that the said millimeter wave spectrum should be auctioned and made fully available for 5G broadband services, and in a recent submission to try, The telco has sparred with global satellite players over the auctioning of the 28G spectrum currently used exclusively by satellite players, but considered super efficient for 5G services as well. Honorable Member Niti Aayog, Dr. Saraswat, in his recent study paper, highlighted that satellite technology in 28 gigahertz would be a cost effective mode to connect the unconnected with high speed, low latency internet. More than 120 countries and rising expressed their intention to follow the ITU decisions and preserve this spectrum for the satellite broadband services. This global consensus reaffirms maintaining the 27.5 gigahertz and above for FSS. Further, a large number of the companies, including ISRO, have launched several satellites into orbit that are dependent on the 28 gigahertz Ka band to receive information transmitted to them from the ground and this frequency band. Friends, I come from the public service broadcaster of India, Prasar Bharati, with its two verticals. One, Doordarshan, which is one of the largest broadcasting organizations of the world in terms of studio and transmission infrastructure, with 36 satellite channels, three of them in high definition, and a DTH platform, DD Free Dish, providing 118 TV channels in free-to-air mode and having a massive viewership base of 43 million people as per the latest ENY reports. And the second, All India Radio, again one of the largest broadcasting organizations in the world in terms of the number of languages of the broadcast and is the spectrum of socio-economic and cultural diversity, originating programming in 23 languages and 179 dialects. Added to this, it has a news on air app which disseminates content in multiple languages and brings to the subscriber more than 250 All India radio channels, live TV, news, current affairs, archival content, and entertainment programs, text, podcasts, and videos from the two verticals. The application also provides recorded and archival content to the subscribers. I have been heading the satellite planning division quite for a number of years, and being one of the major users of the satellite spectrum by both the verticals, I can reaffirm what member Niti Aayog's reassertion that the impact of the loss of the C-band spectrum in the 3.6 gigahertz to 3.67 gigahertz band alone will be felt across the entire 720 INR billion Indian broadcasting industry, carrying 900 plus registered channels to 21 crore households in urban and rural India through approximately 1,735 plus digital platforms, operators, and 50,000 cable operators, which provides direct and indirect employment to almost 1.83 million people. Frequency band on the terrestrial side, 470 to 526 to 584 megahertz, is currently being used by Doordarshan for providing broadcast and live digital latest state of the art power technologies. Prasar Bharati has signed an MOU with Dr. Karandikar, who is present here, IIT Kanpur, collaborative activities in various areas, including direct mobile broadcasting, convergence with the 5G, AI, etc. Further roadmap for DTT will be finalized by Prasar Bharati on the basis of the outcome of POC for the next generation technologies being carried out by IIT Kanpur. The quantum of the spectrum required for DTT services will primarily depend upon appropriate DTT architecture, MFN, SFN, or hybrid, to be used for the future DTT solution as suggested by IIT Kanpur, as well as on the number of DTT transmitters to be included in the DTT multiplex to be planned at different locations in the service area. So, availability of spectrum again is just very crucial for planning these DTT transmitters. Therefore, the need of the hour, friends, is for a holistic assessment of the spectrum requirements for satellite and IMT sectors. A balanced and multi-technology approach enables the creation of omnipresent connectivity infrastructure in the country for achieving digital India and broadband for all targets. A tech-neutral broadband policy has to be supported by a balanced spectrum allocation policy in line with the international standards and international best practices. The spectrum, being a scarce resource, should be allocated optimally between all the service types and for the benefits of the citizens. Friends, because not much time is there with us. I would just like to emphasize that it is of utmost importance for the policymakers to acknowledge that no one solution can fill in all the requirements. For example, terrestrial TV broadcasting, satellite TV broadcasting, and OTT services have their own advantages and disadvantages. Similarly, broadcasting, broadband, and satellite services have their own advantages and importance, catering to the various needs of the people. To sum up, it is important for all the stakeholders to collaborate for a balanced approach for spectrum allocation so as to continue taking the country as a global technical powerhouse, serving the citizens with a quality and technically fueled life. Having said this, I will now move on to our first panelist from Viasat, Mr. Mehul Bhandari, a senior advisor, policy and regulatory, and India focal point in delivering the organization's regulatory and spectrum policy engagements. I invite Mr. Bhandari to share his views with the August gathering. Over to you, Mr. Mehul.
Uh, thank you, Mr. Sunil. It's my honor to be part of this panel. And without much taking this part, my focus will be on the economic benefit of utilizing satellites. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just to set the context that the FCC coverage is around 60% as per the FCC Asia Pacific, and a lot of majority of the population resides in the rural India. And with this background, next slide, please. Yeah. So Viasat, as a global company, global communications company, we believe that everyone and everything can be connected. With this ideology, we have been able to do a lot of innovation in the satellite technology. We not only provide connectivity, we also design a lot of antenna systems and other satellite equipment. And what we have been able to do is compared to the legacy satellite systems, we have been able to reduce the cost per bit to the levels of 400 times and further improve the capacity by 500 times. So this is a significant enhancement in terms of capacity and lowering of the cost that will we want to bring as an innovation and as a service to an offer to India. Next slide, please. So a lot of things have been said about in 28 gigahertz, particularly about the 5G and the satellite coexistence. But let me say that there's no solution has been identified for co-frequency or co-coverage, particularly between the terrestrial and the eSIM. So a few studies have been conducted, and there have been talks of separation distances of the order of 10 kilometers to even 50 kilometers, and we find that they are not feasible enough and may at best be taken on a case-to-case basis. Next slide, please. So this slide is about the status of what's happening in other APAC countries and around the world. Uh, Countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, they are rediscovering in a way 28 gigahertz, particularly for the eSIM applications. And one example, particularly for the South Korea, that deployed 5G in the millimeter wave band. I would like to point out that they were required to deploy 45,000 5G towers, millimeter wave nationwide in a span of 3 years, but they only installed around 161 towers. So that is the situation around in the Asia Pacific region. Coming to the IATA, that is the global aviation that represents 300 more than 300 aviation companies and that operate in more than 120 countries, have also requested IMDA, the regulator in Singapore, to protect the 28 gigahertz for eSIM applications, particularly for the aviation gate-to-gate connectivity. Next. So this is one of the recent study papers that came out by the ABI research that basically tells that the focus of the mobile access or the mobile industry has been more towards the mid band. And in the recent past, we see that a global mobile vendor, Apple, has for its more affordable phone, iPhone SE, has dropped the millimeter wave support, and which clearly tells us that where the focus is going. So this graph clearly tells that the support for the particularly for the 28 gigahertz or the Ka band is the lowest, while for the mid band it's the highest. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is also from one of the studies that talks about the socioeconomic benefits from the satellite usage of the 28 gigahertz. This study was conducted across a few markets in Asia Pacific region, and India was also part of that study. And this study was conducted by Plum Consulting last year, and they found out that if full 28 gigahertz, that is 2 gigahertz of bandwidth, is allocated for the satellite use, approximately 184 US billion dollar per annum can be contributed to the India's GDP economy by 2030. So this is a significant number, and I think we need to see that in a perspective. I would also like to bring some Indian perspective to this. Is that in India there's a tagline for a lot of projects like Gati Shakti, Sagar Mala, Bharat Mala, and a lot of infrastructure and infrastructure development projects are happening. And the tagline is Gati se Shakti. That means speed. With speed, you get power. So that is something we feel that with the physical infrastructure, internet also travels hand in hand, and both needs to be supported in a way. And particularly in last few years, the India's infrastructure, the highways, the railways, ports have been modernized and developed manifold. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and clearly we request the authorities that the right spectrum, right amount, and right conditions of use should be used as a framework. 26 gigahertz has a sufficient bandwidth of approximately 3.25 gigahertz that suffices the requirements of all the mobile needs for the 5G. That is also harmonized as per WRC 19, while 28 gigahertz, particularly 27.5 till 29.5, should be left for the satellite use. Thank you.
Thank you,
The
Mr.
last
Mehul.
slide for the
Yeah.
publishing purpose. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So thank you, Mr. Mehul, for the very thank you, Mr. Mehul, for the very informative and quick sum up. Friends, we have with us Director Spectrum Policy at Intelsat, Mr. Mohaned Juwad, who is an accomplished regulatory expert in spectrum engineering and policy. I invite Mr. Jawad to share his views on the approach. Over to you, Mr. Jawad.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Are my slides
Yeah.
ready?
We can see you. Please move ahead.
Whilst the slides are being prepared, greetings to you all, and it's an honor to be here. And for me, whilst here virtually, I hope I'm here in spirit with you, and one day we can meet in person. I would like to thank SIA-INDIA for inviting Intelsat to present here. For my message, I would like to switch to another frequency band, namely the C-band, and the importance of 5G on the C-band. And if we can see my slides, I'd like to start with the first slide, please. Okay, thank you. So next slide, please. When we talk about 5G, we're focusing on C-band. In fact, WRC after WRC we have focused a lot on this band, and it seems now we have reached an impasse where fundamentally, when you go above 3.6 gigahertz, the global situation becomes fragmented. Therefore, we need to think carefully. We can't have a wholesale approach beyond 3.6 gigahertz. We need to have a balanced way of thinking. We're looking at spectrum bands. For example, the sub 1 gigahertz, the 700 megahertz band with the coverage and the capacity have accounted for 20% of mobile operators using the spectrum. Then we have the mid band, the 2.5 gigahertz and the 3.5 gigahertz, where today mobile base station towers can provide throughputs up to 900 megabits per second. And what about the higher millimeter wave bands, such as the 26 gigahertz? Well, today a single operator can deploy 5G in cities, providing ad hoc capacity demands, while the suburban or rural footprint can rely on coverage spectrum below 1 gigahertz. So a balanced approach is needed to cater for a wide geographical ultra high speed capacity with low latency. And regulators need to be mindful of this, knowing full well that there is an ecosystem in place. And governments and regulators must also ensure that the priorities for mobile broadband policy is achieved above revenue maximization when awarding new frequencies. So success isn't just about allocating new spectrum bands. There is always an ecosystem to be balanced. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. There was a good reason. This is a figure that gives you an overview of what happened after WRC 19. And there was a good reason why this region, Region 3, did not assign an agenda item looking at C-band downlink for IMT, recognizing that C-band is the most efficient, reliable, and economic medium for distribution of media content, with over 80 plus C-band satellites serving Asia, providing today over 3,800 TV channels and generating an annual revenue of 56 billion. So it's a huge market, and it's growing, not just enabling growth, but it's also enabling connectivity and providing viable services to the citizens. And that's fundamentally the reason why Region 3 did not look any agenda item for additional spectrum for IMT. If you go to the next slide, please. This cannot be better presented than when you compare the situation of FSS usage across different regions of the world. This has created, for example, the need for Europe to consider C-band for 5G, primarily because FSS today is limited to business in Europe. But if you look at the situation in Africa or even in Asia, which is very similar in many respects, the usage of satellite in C-band is not just for business to business, but it's also business to consumers. And it enables C-band to provide ubiquitous terminals connectivity, mostly in unknown locations, and therefore developing mitigation measures to protect them is not possible like it was in Europe. And that's why Europe took the decision in the direction it went to. But not every region can do the same. So the message is that one size does not fit all. Every region is different, and regulators need to be mindful of this unique dynamics for Region 3. Next slide, please. Furthermore, when we look at the spectrum proceedings and auctions from across the globe, we don't see MNOs rushing to acquire 100 megahertz of spectrum. Of course, it is desirable to do that, but it's not absolutely necessary. And the evidence show that it's not. Because, for example, Vodafone in the UK has launched 5G with just 50 megahertz. Yes, they have accumulated 18 altogether, but it's not a contiguous bandwidth that they've acquired. And with TDD technology, you can do carrier aggregation. And that's what a lot of MNOs have been doing around the world. Furthermore, countries across the world which have 4 or maybe more MNOs have not acquired 400 megahertz, in other words, 100 megahertz per operator. That has not always been the case. I think only Korea is an example where an MNO took 100 megahertz, but by and large, it has not been that amount. And when you look at the red box in the center of this slide, the evidence show that in Asia, there has been studies that show that the ITU mobile bandwidth available is around 1,500 megahertz, of which 950 megahertz is harmonized for IMT, but only 549 megahertz has actually been licensed so far, which leaves around 40% of spectrum still available. And it's the prudent thing for regulators to do, which is to look at what spectrum is still available before seeking more spectrum, as we have been told WRC after every WRC. And this notion that MNOs need 100 megahertz really needs to be challenged, because we have seen, not just from the auctions, but from studies that were done, for example, the Ofcom study in the United Kingdom, they have debunked the notion that 5G needs 100 megahertz per operator. It has shown that you can achieve 770 megabits per second in the download with just 40 megahertz non-contiguous spectrum. So this is a notion that really needs to be tackled, and I'm very glad to see that the Indian regulators are very prudently looking at this matter very carefully. Because the other aspect is that C-band is the sweet spot between coverage and capacity. And in a country like India, we're not seeing that C-band is actually used for coverage. A typical base station is not going to provide more than 1 kilometer cell radius. So this is an important aspect, that we have been led to believe that C-band is going to be used for coverage, when in reality it's only being deployed in metropolitan areas. Next slide, please. So more C-band spectrum, is it really needed for IMT? India should look at the future spectrum use based on not only the demand for spectrum, but also the economic and social value. For example, there is now scope for refarming existing mobile spectrum. A lot of MNOs are looking at refarming the 3G spectrum. And also considering potential still remains for increasing the 4G investment that has been done across the world. We believe it's about 1.7 trillion, according to the GSMA studies. And this investment still needs to be recouped by the MNOs before you rush into more spectrum. And I was actually in the Mobile World Congress not too long ago, where the talk there is that 5G, just like with other IMT technologies, will first be for business before it becomes a consumer service. And in many cases, the current flavor of 5G is really 4G plus right now. Also, a country as large as India, a mixture of technologies is needed. For example, the expansion of Wi-Fi, the integration of cellular with unlicensed use will greatly support the data rate of broadband delivery, and an ecosystem that includes terrestrial but also non-terrestrial technologies, as we've been hearing from my colleague Bashir and the Secretary General of JSOWAR, where the role of satellite is actively playing a role in the standard of 5G, where an ecosystem of different technologies will take place. So from our side, we see an opportunity to play a role in 5G. And some of these requirements are identified by having a balanced approach from a regulatory point of view and a policy point of view. Next slide, please. But if admins are still considering to go above maybe 3.6, we have been hearing from admins in Region 3, then there is a need to consider two aspects: the FSS co-frequency operation within the same frequency range, and more importantly, and this is a matter that's not always looked at, is the adjacent impact, operations of spectrum in the adjacent band, where the LMBs of FSS receivers are very sensitive. These are very sensitive RF component, which will be saturated by a high-power 5G base station nearby. So adjacent band studies need to be looked at very carefully. Next slide, please. I have 2 more slides. And the right mitigation measures need to be in place, since mobile signals can interfere with FSS in 2 fundamental ways. First, they can saturate the LMB of the earth station, even when the mobile signal is in the adjacent band. But also the out-of-band emissions of the mobile signal can cause in-band interference to the FSS signal. And to mitigate these interference, FSS receivers require 3 key fundamental aspects from regulators. And the regulatory authority in India is looking at this very carefully. Earth stations need to be fitted with bandpass filters. And in order for the filter to operate, there needs to be a frequency separation, or what is known as a guard band, between the FSS and the mobile signal. And the 5G power levels need to be adapted in a way that the 5G base stations out-of-band emissions do not cause interference in the adjacent side of FSS. So these are the 3 key areas that regulators really need to be mindful of. And I'm glad to see that India is taking the right approach step by step in towards that direction. Next slide, please. With all of this said and done, when it comes to the final thoughts, which is the reality, that current and future of C-band must guide regulators' decisions in a very careful way. Mobile connectivity challenges in India is not caused by spectrum shortages only. It is also by infrastructure, investment, affordability, and coverage. And that's where the satellite aspect plays a critical role in terms of providing the coverage, not IMT base stations, which are not going to be the coverage solution to provide broadband across all the citizens in India. Also, refarming 2G and 3G spectrum. By using dynamic spectrum sharing, MNOs are able to use the same spectrum band for different radio access technologies, such as 4G and 5G. Sharing spectrum amongst MNOs. We today, as an industry, share the spectrum between different satellite operators through coordination. MNOs have yet to share their spectrum or even their infrastructure. In the UK, there is now an initiative stipulated in the licensing requirements that MNOs have to share the infrastructure in order to bridge the digital divide and connect their citizens. This is in the UK. So we'd like to see more of that investment and sharing from MNOs. And also using higher millimeter waves, particularly the 26 gigahertz, where it's already been deployed in some cases. And I recognize that it's not as effective, but it does have the capacity attribute in terms of providing the ad hoc connectivity to concert or football stadiums and the likes. So there is an alternative to achieve a win-win approach and deploy 5G services, whilst at the same time protecting other services that have been using the spectrum for decades. So there is an ownership from the satellite industry that has used this spectrum for years now, since the 1970s. And I think there is a win-win approach if we take the right balanced way forward. With that, I conclude with my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohaned, for the deep insights and a very illustrious presentation. Our next panelist is Dr. Laura Roberti, who is the Director for Spectrum and Market Access in Telesat and is globally responsible for the Telesat regulatory licenses and authorizations. Over to you, Ms. Laura, for your deliberations.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished chair and panelists, and a big thank you to SIA for this opportunity, and congratulations on your first anniversary. If possible, yes, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'll just touch very briefly on the defining features that make the new LEO system planned by Telesat, Telesat Lightspeed, a truly cutting-edge design. It will use two different types of orbits to focus capacity where most needed. It will use optical inter-satellite links for an optimized network design that will allow Telesat Lightspeed to use far fewer satellites than other constellations. Reconfigurable fast-hopping beams that allow to cover the entire field of view of the satellite, onboard processing, low latency, and overall an unprecedented amount of capacity, which will lead to a transformational economics with the gigabits link to a single location. Next slide, please. The main applications envisaged for Telesat Lightspeed cover enterprise, community connectivity, and very importantly, mobile backhaul. Distribution will be via local telcos to provide a flexible and competitive solution to the end customer. Next slide, please. Coming now to the topic of the conference, I will focus on what I believe is the main synergetic, what I believe is one of the main synergetic aspects between satellite and 5G, which is the 5G backhaul aspect. Overall, 5G is also promising lower latency, faster data speeds. So also the high capacity backhaul link must be able to achieve the same or similar performance metrics. So it is in this context that backhaul via LEO satellites is really the ideal solution to extend the connectivity reach of telecom operators. In fact, backhaul via satellites, and specifically LEO satellites, is capable to decrease the time to market, lower the risk of investment, and actually allow MNOs to achieve a positive return on their investments. It also allows to eliminate large infrastructure deployments, and also allow for revenue generation in areas that are normally hard to reach. But 5G is the big buzzword, but 5G is not the main connectivity issue. The main connectivity issue is actually lack of sufficiently good connectivity for a large portion of the population. And in that respect, the satellite in general can really be the answer for a rapid rollout of broadband across India and other countries with similar issues. So all this to say that there is, rather than a confrontation, there is a clear need for a synergy between satellite and terrestrial operators, and this synergy needs also to be reflected on the use and allocation of spectrum. Next slide, please. So speaking of spectrum, this is the spectrum that is planned to be used by Telesat Lightspeed, both for the user terminal and the gateways, and there is also a portion of the contended 28 gigahertz band. But Telesat is not the only, Lightspeed is not the only system. There are many more existing or planned non-GSO system or networks that are planning to use this band either for the terminals or the gateway or both. And the design of this satellite for Telesat, like for Telesat Lightspeed, cannot change, it's fixed, they cannot move elsewhere in terms of spectrum. So in other words, this truly is an essential band for the expansion of satellite broadband service provision. This is clearly an ongoing issue in India, the allocation of 28 gigahertz, and many words have already been spent on this, both on the method of allocation and the service to which to allocate this band. Next slide, please. So tackling, first of all, the issue of spectrum allocation, there is a most significant difference between spectrum sharing between satellite operators and terrestrial operators in this frequency band and in general in microwave frequency bands. So for terrestrial mobile services, spectrum cannot be shared amongst the operators. While in the case of satellites, the same microwave spectrum can be and is shared between multiple operators in the same geographical location. Therefore, assignment by auction of satellite spectrum would lead to, one, unnecessary spectrum segmentation and therefore a very inefficient use of spectrum. Two, artificial limitation of the range of number of satellite services to be provided to the end customer, because ultimately a spectrum auction will allocate spectrum only to a limited number of satellite operators, while the reality is that all can coexist. And finally, there are absolutely no precedents of microwave satellite spectrum auctions anywhere else in the world, in fact. 28 gigahertz band is being considered in India also for possible auction for 5G. There was a recent consultation by TRAI, and in the consultation itself, it was clearly stated that due to the terrestrial propagation characteristics, this band can be used for 5G deployment only in limited areas, is not for coverage. Therefore, exclusive nationwide allocation to terrestrial 5G would unnecessarily sterilize valuable spectrum in area where 5G in practice will never be deployed. This will lead to spectrum denial to satellites, which in turn can provide instant national and in fact global coverage in the same band. So overall, the sensible thing to do would be, first of all, to assess actual usage of other bands for 5G before this band that is so important for satellite is considered for auction. And next and last slide, please. So just to conclude, so use of 28 gigahertz band by satellite. I've already mentioned the importance. I've already mentioned that 5G backhauling, satellite backhauling for 5G can be effectively provided by satellite. Overall, the road would seem to be clear for a win-win strategic approach to telecommunication in India. Limiting the satellite capacity by limiting access to part of the Ka band will reduce, of course, the backhauling capability, and therefore damaging this synergetic approach. In any case, and I believe this to be a very important point, FSS fixed earth station, including gateways, should always be allowed in the band because they can be coordinated. So overall, Telesat view, and I believe the view of the entire satellite industry, is for the 28 gigahertz band to be retained for satellite use, allowing also ubiquitous user terminals, for instance, and also mobile user terminals, for instance, for in-flight connectivity and so on, and for satellite gateways to be definitely allowed in the entire band. There are some conclusions, but we are running out of time, so I will leave them for consideration of the audience, and I wish to thank all once again very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, esteemed panelists, for the very crisp and informative presentations. We are running short of time, and my apologies, we will not be able to take questions in this session. I would request the audience to post the questions on the organizer website, which can be suitably addressed in due course of time. Thank you all very much for your participation and for a valuable time.